into it. We don't have a lot of time. So the UK school system, what can we say about it? What can we learn from it? And again, what can we share with each other in terms of best practices and practices also to avoid, as my American colleague earlier mentioned. So, let's get started. Let's jump straight in. Is this? No. Numbers with regards to the British education system. So, in terms of compulsory, we're talking 5 to 16 years of age. Continue. About 30,000 schools in the UK, 2,500 of which are private, and we'll talk about private schools later as our host and our MC. Private schools in the UK do have a bit of a reputation. So, in terms of numbers of students, this also includes university. We've got about 10 million students currently studying in the UK, and again, similar to the US, many of those are international students. So for public universities, there's a maximum cost, but that's only limited to UK nationals. You can charge people from other countries and other continents a lot more. So I would say that the number of international students is constantly increasing. 600,000 teachers, and getting smaller. I'm sure that's a problem in many countries. We'll talk about that later. And in terms of the GDP, how much does the UK spend on education? 4%. If we compare that to France, where it's 5.4%, in Spain, which is actually where I live, 4.3%, and 6% in Morocco. I think we have a couple of officials here, so maybe you can confirm that figure for me. But it goes to show that maybe the public system in the UK doesn't get as much support and funding as people think. The key stages, let's continue because we don't have a lot of time, but let's get on to this one. This one is important because, well, as we can see from the map, we're talking about the UK, which is actually 4 countries. We've got England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And each country, well, there is a national curriculum, but each country, they can adapt it a little bit, mainly to reflect differences between them, so whether it's linguistic differences, cultural differences, historical things, things which are specific to Wales or to Scotland. And, when I say linguistic, these countries do very much have their own languages. And most of it will be done in English, but they will, of course, have to learn their own dialects or languages as well. I'm sure in Morocco, being such a big country divided into different regions, you have something similar. But within each country in the UK, it's quite similar. Okay? In terms of following this curriculum, it's only maintained schools or state schools. Private schools, independent schools, they're free to choose whatever they want. They can do whatever content they want, and the curriculum is up to them to decide. Of course, the curriculum that they create has to be shared with the Ministry of Education and approved, but in general, they have a lot of freedom to do whatever they want. And I think a lot of the state system, they take inspiration from the innovations of the private sector, which I think is common pretty much everywhere all over the world. 5 minutes, thank you. Let's continue. Assessment, we're going to skip this because I had a much longer presentation prepared, but let's go to the relevant stuff. Can we continue, please? In terms of comparing state and private, I'm going to go through some of the key things. So let's start with state. The pros, cost-free, of course. Wow, cost-free if you pay taxes. Generally cost-free. Diverse student body. Of course, when you're in a state school, you get that diversity, which the UK is so famous for. And that really is a really enriching cultural experience. Continue. Regulated curriculum, maintained or state schools, they must follow the national curriculum. Local access. There's a local school around the corner. And community engagement, going back to this idea of, well, if the school is in the neighborhood, then you feel part of the neighborhood, you relate to other people, and you become more part of a community. If we're talking about the cons or the negatives, it's the same story everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Limited resources, class sizes, varied quality. So a state school in a very nice neighborhood is not going to be the same as a state school in a more deprived neighborhood or in a part of the country. So there is a lot of difference between some state schools, depending on where they are. Continue. Just in general, the level of support. With private, of course, class sizes, but now we're talking about the reverse, smaller class sizes, resources and facilities, academic flexibility. Going back to the curriculum, they have this academic flexibility. Not just what they learn, but how they learn it. I think everywhere, the latest trend, and it's been mentioned a couple of times today, is not focusing so much on content, but competence. It's not what you know, it's how you get to know it, or how you learn it, which is hugely important. Private schools, of course, prepare very well for universities, networking opportunities. Some of them can be quite, introverted societies, specialized programs, and the negatives. High cost. We mentioned earlier the cost. I actually went to a private school myself, and now, not when I went, but now the cost is £40,000 per year. So yeah, we're talking big costs. And if you have 2 or 3 kids going to that school over the 7 years, you're talking close to £1 million. Social exclusivity as well, talking about those communities in some private schools, which are they don't go outside of their community. It's a very close-knit thing. And it can cause some kind of levels of social exclusivity. Pressure to perform. Of course, these academic institutions, they command big numbers, big fees, because they not guarantee, but almost guarantee access to university, access to higher levels of education. Some of the cons, lack of regulation, lack of regulation. So again, this generally is a good thing, having this flexibility with what they can teach, but at the same time, not every single school will get that right every year, all the time. So there are going to be some instances where an experiment has failed, and parents have paid a lot of money for a failed experiment. And finally, potential disconnect. Good. This is where I think you asked your question about the typical British school, and I think boarding school is where you sleep. This is a classic British thing, I think, but it's not as common as you think. It really isn't. I mean, I went to boarding school, but that's not the rule, it's the exception. And actually, this is the school that I went to. And I would say that this is probably where you can get the most complete education for a child. Not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom as well. Can we skip? Do you mind if I skip quite a few? Because that was my school uniform, by the way. Okay. Just now for the last minute, talking about some of the challenges facing the UK. And when I talk about this, I'm talking mainly about the state, or the state system, the maintained schools. And again, it's going to be a similar topic in other countries and in other markets. Teacher shortages. Unlike Belgium, I think it was, where a speaker earlier talked about the respect that teachers have in society. Not so much. And I think, again, that's a common, unfortunately, thing. Funding cuts, not as much money as there was before. We saw earlier the GDP. UK is lower than Spain, France, Morocco, and many other countries. In general, the GDP is around 4.5 to 5%. We're pretty low. Mental health. Again, an issue. Absenteeism, COVID. I think, I don't know if it's common everywhere, but the levels of absenteeism from schools has just gone crazy. Digital divide. Well, I think digitalization is a huge benefit and an opportunity, but if we're not going at the same pace and we don't all have access to these same resources, then of course, it's not really benefiting everybody. Okay, this has to be the final one. Sorry. In terms of trends, and I think this is kind of where we can learn from each other now, this final bit, I think a lot of curriculums around the world are inspired, especially recent curriculums, inspired by things like the Agenda 2030, sustainability, inclusivity, opportunities for everybody. I think that's become a big part of most curriculums, including the UK. Educating the whole student, not just do you know your maths, do you know this equation, do you know all the rivers in this part of the country, but things like public speaking, life skills, which is something that the UK traditionally hasn't done. You know, we weren't taught to public speak.
Really inspiring and interesting listening to you, Chris, but sorry.
I'm sorry as well.